Hello, everyone. Welcome to the course, this online version of Philosophy 305, Ethics and the Media. I think that besides just telling students what the requirements are, and the basics on how the class should be run, the teacher has an obligation, obviously, to give some overview of the material that'll be read and what the sort of purpose or point of the course is. And I think that one of the things the teacher should do is just sort of explain how he or she thinks, or what they're reading, or what their agenda is. And that's what this little introductory talk really is. It's just looking at some of the things that have influenced me, both long term and short term, recent reading and background reading for me. And to give you a sense of, we won't read any of these authors that I'll be quoting in this little introduction, but they're the kind of things that have influenced me in how I think about the course, how I think the course should go, or what I'm trying to do in the course, and what we're trying to explore in the course. So I thought I would, in addition to whatever else I do in terms of introducing the course, is just go through these quotes with you to give you a sense of my background, so that might help in framing what we do in the course, why I've chosen the readings that I have to explore the issues that I have chosen, and in the way that I've chosen to do them. So that's what I'm going to do. Here's some recent reading. I've been reading Virginia Woolf lately. Great 20th century English novelist and person of letters. And she wrote really pretty amazing novels, if you ever read Virginia Woolf. But she was also a very important person in English language culture in the first half of the 20th century. And this is a little quote that I was struck by. She wrote in 1924. In basically, she was involved in a dispute or a disagreement with another novelist named Arnold Bennett, an older novelist, and she made this remark, or she wrote this, which was became very, very famous remark. In or about December 1910, human character changed. This is contexted in her dispute with Bennett, who was an older, perhaps more well-established English novelist, but a novelist who was very different from Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was sort of seen as a modernist, which is a term of the time, somebody who was writing novels, but very different novels from people like Arnold Bennett, novels that were seen as more experimental, formalistic, less conventional. And he apparently had attacked the sort of new modernist experimental novel in support of his own more traditional way of writing. And she was sort of, I think, what I can get from the essay, that she was really defending her approach and basically saying that it was more timely, that times had changed, people had changed, and so the novel had to change. More or less consigning him to the past, but maybe that's true. That he had outlived his contemporariness. But this notion that human character can change historically is getting us into the closer to the subject matter of this course. Here's the longer quote. She says. Right after she says that in 1910 human character changed, she goes on to say, I'm not saying that one went out as one might into a garden and there saw that a rose had flowered or that a hen had laid an egg. The change was not sudden and definite like that, but a change there was nevertheless. And since one must be arbitrary, let us date it about the year 1910, which was about 15 years before she was writing. The first signs of it are recorded in the books of Samuel Butler. In The Way of All Flesh, in particular, the plays of Bernard Shaw continue to record it. It's pretty amazing. Those were very important authors of their time, Samuel Butler and George Bernard Shaw, who are very little read today. Unlike Virginia Woolf, it's interesting. She said, continues, in life one can see the change, if I may use a homely illustration, in the character of one's cook. The Victorian cook lived like a leviathan in the lower depths, formidable, silent, obscure, inscrutable. The Georgian cook is a creature of sunshine and fresh air. Now, the Victorian cook is a reference to a servant of the Victorian era, which was, let's just say, late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, whereas the Georgian would be her own age. She's referring to Queen Victoria and I suppose King George, who was, I guess, king in the 1920s. But as an example, the way that, again, she was an upper class person, obviously, talking about her cook and things like that. She's been much, in her own time and in the present, been much criticized for being, a kind of a snob and also kind of an upper class elitist point of view. But she's describing the way that her relationship or the relationship of a person like herself with a servant has changed. The Victorian cook, let's say the cook around 1870, lived like a leviathan, like a whale, basically, under the water in the lower depths, formidable, silent, obscure, inscrutable. The Georgian cook is a creature of sunshine and fresh air, in and out of the drawing room, now to borrow the Daily Herald newspaper, now to ask advice about a hat. Do you ask for more solemn instances of the power of the human race to change? Now, I'm not endorsing what she says here. It's kind of interesting the way that she gives the example of one of her servants. But just as an example of somebody trying to understand or trying to understand the changes that are happening in her own historical period. And those changes are widespread. Historical changes in the way people live, the way they think, the way they relate to other people. Do you ask for more solemn instances of the power of the human race to change? Read the Agamemnon, the great Aeschylus Greek tragedy, and see whether in process of time your sympathies are not almost entirely with Clytemnestra. That's an interesting remark. I mean, what Woolf is saying is that this tragedy of Agamemnon, the great Greek hero who comes from the Trojan War and is murdered by his wife and her lover, I guess what she's implying is that when it was written by Sophocles 2,500 years ago, Clytemnestra, the wife, was the villain. But now we may be more likely to read her as being the hero. And it's it's an example, like her example of the different relationship that a upper class bourgeois person would have with a servant, of changes in consciousness, changes in feelings and sympathies that we would be less likely, perhaps, reading the tragedy of Agamemnon today, and seeing Clytemnestra as the villain. We might see her as the heroine. Or consider the married life of the Carlyles. The Carlyles are a very important literary couple of the 19th century in England. Consider the married life of the Carlyles and bewail the waste, the futility for him and for her of the horrible domestic tradition which made it seemly for a woman of genius, that would be, I forget her name, the wife as opposed to the husband, to spend her time chasing beetles, scouring saucepans instead of writing books. That is, the Carlyles were this very important literary couple, but the husband, Thomas Carlyle, was the more prominent one, and his wife, I'm sorry, I don't know her first name, who was equally talented. Woolf is saying took an inferior position and kind of wasted her life playing this female role of the time, this Victorian female role, instead of asserting herself and realizing her potentiality. That is, that might have been seen, the woman taking the inferior role. At the time, it might have seemed proper, and it probably did seem proper to the typical English person. But from Woolf's point of view, and what she's saying is from her vantage in history, it's obviously a tragedy that this woman of genius never really got to realize her potential because she was a woman, because women were more oppressed than perhaps, or women's oppression was just taken for granted in 19th century England as being normal. And but things have changed, right? It's post 1910. All human relations have shifted, Woolf says. Those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. Let us agree to place one of these changes about the year 1910. Again, a very complex statement from Virginia Woolf, and leads in all sorts of different directions, and perhaps very controversial. But what I wanted to get was this sort of example of somebody who's doing what we're trying to do, which is to try to understand, to try to articulate the kind of changes that she sees happening around her, and also changes within us. Because what she's saying is not just that the world has changed. She said that human character has changed. That is, that we have changed. The world has changed and human beings have changed. They think differently, they feel differently, they might even perceive differently. That life in general has changed, and that human beings themselves have changed their character. That's the kind of thing that we will be exploring in this course in a more contemporary way. But I think that Woolf, in a way, was trying to do what we're trying to do, is to try to understand the present moment. What is going on? How are we changing? How is the world changing? And trying to understand that and to grasp it. Now, Virginia Woolf is I'm going back in time here. Virginia Woolf wrote in 1924 about historic change and about change in thinking and feeling, change in human relationships, change in the way that we conceive of religion, she says, in literature and politics. This sense of change is very much a theme of earlier literature, 19th century literature. And here's Nietzsche in 1882. Nietzsche, the maybe great German philosopher. This is a book he wrote called The Gay Science in 1882. He asked the question, are we not perpetually falling backward, sideward, forward in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as though through an infinite nothing? That's in that famous section where Nietzsche has somebody say that God is dead, which was, pretty hot stuff in the 1880s to say. But this, unlike Woolf, who's a sort of very rational figure, very careful thinker, Nietzsche was a much more romantic figure. And what he's expressing here is some dismay, obviously, that this sense of disorientation, this sense of not knowing, in being a modern person, not knowing where you are, not knowing up or down, up from down, being literally, not literally, but metaphorically being disoriented, not knowing where you are, not having a sense of a center that would help to define things. This, of course, as I said, is in the famous section where he talks about the death of God, and certainly what he would see as the absence of God is perhaps the cause of this disorientation, that people don't know how they're supposed to live, how they're supposed to think, where they are, what the purpose of life is, et cetera, et cetera. And either the cause of this or one of the effects of this, perhaps, I don't know, is the downfall of religion as he saw it. But just another example of somebody sort of asking, where the heck are we? What is going on? I think it's actually quite a contemporary thought. I mean, I hear it all the time from everybody, at least in America, that this sense of dismay, of being puzzled by the present, this sense of not knowing where we're headed, very contemporary, I think, Nietzsche's remark. If we go further back in time to the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, 1849, in their characterization of modern society, modern industrial capitalist society, they characterized our form of life by saying that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profane. So this is about 30 years before Nietzsche. You had these two communist revolutionaries characterizing what modern capitalist society was, or what just modern technological free market society was a society that had basically torn itself away from its roots, and that was in a process of perpetual change, constantly revolutionizing itself. Now, they thought that the cause of that was in capitalist economic forms itself, or themselves, that the capitalism demanded constant revolutionizing of ways that we make things and sell things and distribute things. But they generally were trying to catch the mood of 1849. I mean, imagine 1849 was a long time ago, but already people were thinking that, oh my gosh, things are changing so quickly. We're changing so quickly. Consciousness is changing. There's a long tradition of people trying to understand historic change. And in a way, that's the big theme of this course, is the effects of historical change on human consciousness, forms of human consciousness, which is what all these people, in a way, were trying to figure out, that I've been quoting. The last quote here is from Hegel, who was a great German philosopher, had a big influence on Marx. This is from his introduction to a work called The Philosophy of Right. Very famous quote where he says, "Everyone is a son of his time. So philosophy also is its time, apprehended in thoughts. It is just as foolish to fancy that any philosophy can transcend its present world as that an individual could leap out of his time or jump over Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, that you're as stuck in your historical period and its ways of thinking and its limitations and its prejudices it's as impossible to leap out of that context as it would be to jump over the island of Rhodes. I mean, people are constantly trying to do it, right? But of course they fail. This gets us back to 1820. This philosopher saying that historical change, has this tremendous influence on thinking, philosophy. He says philosophy is its time, apprehended in thoughts. That philosophy will be marked by, will be limited by, will be determined by the period in which it carries itself out, which is, as I would say, is this consciousness of the effects of contemporary history and historical change on forms of thinking, which again is kind of what we're doing in this course. So I just wanted to, give you a sense. These are not authors that we'll read. These are rather my personal intellectual background in approaching this course, what this course should be about. It is an ethics course insofar as we are generally concerned with moral issues in the broadest sense, but it could be also be thought of as a course in the way that history and especially forms of media, forms of communication affect us. And certainly, although we won't be going into particular ethical issues in this course in any kind of sort of systematic way, maybe at the end it'll get more like that. But it's more of sort of questioning how we're being changed by history, and especially, as we'll look at in the first readings, by changes in the history of media and expression.